folks, welcome to day 2 of our Dean's Compact quarterly meeting. Just wanted to say a couple things. It's great to see everybody. It was a wonderful day yesterday. Again, welcome to day 2 of our meeting today. We had a wonderful day yesterday, hearing from our ODE folks, Johanna and Krista, of course, and Dr. Tyrone Howard from the University of California. For those who weren't here, it's great to see you. Dr. Howard spoke on closing the achievement gap, what school districts and institutions of higher education can do. It's a wonderful presentation. I think all of us got some great ideas and incentive from it. I also have a couple other folks I want to welcome. We have Rich Van Voorst here from YSU School Site Program, his colleague Kenneth Miller. They should also be joining us today, and Carissa Schutzman from she's the director of the UC Evaluation Services Center. So if you see her in one of the breakout rooms, say hi, as we're always welcoming new folks and glad to see those. Just a couple reminders. If you haven't yet, please do enter the name, affiliation, email in the chat box, or use the rename function to enter your information on the participation list. We just love to have that accurate record of who's here so we can keep tabs. Also, there will be an evaluation link that I believe Stanley will put in the chat throughout the meeting, but especially at the end. We love feedback. We always like to improve what we're doing at Dean's Compact and make sure we're doing things right. So the feedback is huge for us. Here in about 5-10 minutes, we're gonna break out into our particular groups. And again, those of you who are new, we have 5 of those. One is a dissemination committee where we really look at planning. That's Dr. Jim Gay. We have our Impact Evaluation Committee ran by Dr. Barb Hansen, our Policy Committee, Dr. Deb Tully, and our Low Incidence Committee, Dr. Sally Brannon. We also have our Community of Practice that Dr. Jennifer Otley spends time with us and runs that. So we'll go out into breakout rooms, and you may be lifted into one of those. So they'll go from about 10 o'clock to about 10:40. And then after that, we get to spend some more time with Dr. Howard, again, talking about the closing the achievement gap, what school districts and institutions in higher ed of education can do. So it was a wonderful day yesterday as we learned a lot from that. So we have a little bit of time as people start coming in. Stan is going to shuffle us right out here at 8:30. So we have about 10 more minutes of real good jazz music and some other things. Deb, do you have any other announcements that we can share right now?
Thanks, Mark. I think letting everybody know who was not here yesterday that there is a new RFA posted on the Compact site for advancing post-secondary options for students with disabilities. So everybody go to the Compact site, take a look at that. If you have questions, please contact Jennifer Otley, and she will be able to help you out. And we will use our typical panel review process for that. So if there's anybody out there interested in helping review, please let Jennifer know.
Great.
Thanks, Mark.
Yep, I think since we have a little bit more time, what I'd like to do at the bottom of your program, folks, we also have the next year's meeting schedule for Ohio Dean's Compact and the P20 Literacy Collaborative. So if you haven't seen that yet, please do take a look. The first meeting is September 8th to 9th. Quarter 2 meeting, December 8th to 9th on December, March 9th and 10th. And then our last one is June 1st through 2nd for the 23rd, with our 10th annual statewide conference from January 25th to the 27th. So again, we'd love to have you put that on your calendar so you can take part. We always, again, love seeing everybody, and all that information is so valuable for us in higher ed. So thank you again. So again, I think that's at the bottom, right? At the bottom of the
Yeah, all the way at the bottom of the second page. Yeah. If you scroll
right
down, Stanley, if you can move that down a little bit more. Anybody there? Okay. Well, you've got it in the chat. So if you download that, you can see the schedule at the bottom of the second page. Thanks.
That sounds good. That's good. As we go to the 8:30 mark, does anybody have any comments about yesterday and any thoughts, great thoughts that maybe you went home and thought of some neat things you'd like to share?
Hey, Mark, I'm wondering if any of the resources that Dr. Howard shared, there were a couple of books that he referenced, would be of interest to anybody working on any of the incentive grants.
Mark, this is Dave Brobeck. One of the thoughts I had was we have had conversations in Ohio about taking efforts to adjust how we enter people into the teaching profession. And that if our testing methodology is a roadblock, then we collectively can consider alternatives. What can we do differently? What are other options that would guarantee somebody of quality who can be effective with the children, but may need a different pathway to get to the same end outcome, that being a classroom teacher. And I'm mindful that of the superintendent from Bedford who shared they have an extensive alternative licensure program with degreed African-American males particular, but the one thing that's the biggest hindrance is the OAE. And these are proud people who have degrees, who've come back and added the teaching courses and done the field work and have shown up and are desired by the district to be hired. But then the OAE comes into play, and it doesn't help anyone in that regard, in my view.
Yeah, great point. Great point, David. Agreed. I'll be honest, I still, the one example, what a great example of equity versus equality yesterday. I still have that floating around my mind a little bit. I got a couple other examples that people had sent me, but he had some wonderful examples. Getting back to Deb's comment about if anybody's interested in some of those resources, Deb, should they put that interest in the chat or should they send it to me? I'm happy to collect those.
Sure, either way, Mark, is fine. Thank you.
Do we have a list of those, Stanley, by any chance, of those resources that we can put back in? I'm not sure if we do or not. That may be something.
Mark, there were a couple slides that had books referenced, so I can find it in a minute if you give me a
great. So
Took us-
double take a look, see if they can put those resources from Dr. Howard chat and let you know on those. And if you are interested, why don't you do this? I would put that in the chat, but also send it to me, and I'd be happy to collect your names and see what we can do about getting those resources to you. Again, that's my email is mseals@bgsu.edu. It's also in the chat up on top. So I'm happy to create that list, and we'll see what we can do there.
Kathy has her hand up.
Hi, yes, one of the things I was thinking about, and I've been working on some of Krista's teams, we have different plans to, for the K-12 teaching population, as well as trying to increase diversity at the higher ed level. Let's specifically share those thoughts with Dr. Howard and have him reflect on those and see if he has any input to help guide the state.
Great idea, Kathy. Since you brought it up, do you mind if I refer to you just to get the right message there? That'd be great.
Actually, if we could have Krista, because she's got all the collective materials from both teams,
Yep.
I think she'd be a better person to ask the question. But if
Krista,
she can't, I'd be happy to.
okay. Krista, are you good with that?
I'm happy to ask the question.
Thank you very much. Folks, any other comments at all before we'll let Stanley put on the music for about 3 or 4 minutes before we break out? All right, Stanley, the stage is yours.
Right. I put a link in the chat, which will be an easy way for each of the committees to access their folders. I just put it on a Google Drive, and then I'll try to jump into each room and drop off files there as well.
That's excellent.
Stanley, it says access needed. I don't know if that's.
I thought I set that up. Let me try again. You know how it is.
I do. I sure do. Mark, the names of the books are in the chat.
Great, great. Thank you, Deb.
Mhm.
Okay, I put the link in there now. Hopefully that works.
Let's see. Yep.
Oh, great.
And Jennifer put a link to the Padlet for the COP in the chat.
Perfect. Thank you, Jennifer.
And if you're not on the COP and you haven't seen it, you're welcome to take a look also. We have a ton of resources there. And if you're thinking about applying for that post-secondary grant, you'll kind of see how we act as a community, how we're sharing resources, supporting one another. So feel free to take a look.
So again, for those folks who are just coming on board, again, we're going to be whisked away to our breakout rooms here in about 2 or 3 minutes. We'll reconvene about 10 o'clock and we'll have report outs from our committees around 10:40. And then we will have Dr. Howard do his second presentation of the day, which will come back and we'll finish about 11:45 and kind of conclude our meeting. We should be finished about 12 o'clock, right about there, and we'll adjourn.
Oh, and just a heads up for those in the community of practice breakout, you're going to have a sub breakout that I'll be there to assist with after a little bit.
Yeah, would you have the address for Meg? She asked a really good question. Address for the September meeting?
Oh, for OCLC?
Yes.
Yeah,
Uh-oh, we lost you.
whoops, I'm sorry. I'll put it in chat when we come back at 10, if that's okay.
Thank you very much.
Hey, Stanley, this is Nicole Lucy. Can you send me to the COP breakout? Sorry, I had a scheduling issue this morning.
No, we're just now getting started. We're about to go.
Okay.
Get a couple last people in their place and we'll be off. All right, here we go, everybody.
Thank you, Stanley. Folks, welcome back, everybody. It is good to see everybody. We had another great meeting with Dr. Jim Gay running the show for the Dissemination Committee. So it was good information. What I'd like to do now, folks, is give each group a little bit of time to report back out, and then we'll go from there. There's really no specific order. Is there anyone that would like to go first in this case?
I'm willing to go first, Mark. This is Sally.
Okay, so let's do our low incident committee. Sally, you're on.
Yes, because usually we go last, so I'm going to jump us right up there to first today.
Great.
Welcome, everybody. Soon it'll be the first day of summer, but it is a lovely sunny day here in Ohio in June. The Low Incidence Committee had a full agenda today, and by all means, I'm going to run through and update you as best I can. We had lots going on. The first thing that we did, which I think is really important, is we celebrated 4 individuals who were completers in the new intervener program. And I think it's most interesting that we had 4 in our first cohort because we are one of only 4 intervener programs that exist in the United States. So big applause to the folks at Shawnee State for putting the program together and for having 4 completers. And I'm quickly going to give their names off. Sarah Taylor, Crystal Campbell, who both work at the Pioneer Center in Ross County, Linda Sharp, who works at Logan Hocking Middle School, and Amy Johnson, who works for Westfall Local Schools. So they're out there reaching and teaching and working with students who have deaf blindness as interveners. So I think this is a big round of applause for that first group of completers. The next piece, we had our usual updates. Karen is excitedly told us that we are ready to start cohort 6 of the visually impaired program. Mark, I appreciate that. Can't believe it. Nod of the head there. That's definitely unbelievable. But they were thrilled to be back in person and being able to see each other this last little bit of the spring semester and as they lead into summer. Doug shared with us that the Deaf and Hard of Hearing Consortium is moving along. They are ready to start cohort 3. In fact, cohort 3 just started their summer courses with Bowling Green State University leading that group and getting them started off on their work towards licensure. And there's 14 in that group. So I think that that's important to say. Cohort 2 is, of course, finishing up and they're applying for jobs. Doug noted that there's still more jobs in the city than in our more rural districts, but we're getting there, and at least there are job opportunities and employment opportunities for these folks. We also want to note that with the intervener program, we have a new collaborative association that was a direct outreach and looking for individuals for the intervener program at both the Ohio School for the Blind and the Ohio School for the Deaf. So that's a big collaborative piece that Doug and Karen are taking on there with the intervener program to recruit people for the program. The next thing that we got to see, and I know other groups got to see some previews today too, but Deb shared with us a preview of the Dean's Compact work history that will be available on the site on the new site for everybody to see. But we got to listen to the Low Incidence Committee and the work that's been done over the last 10 years. And it was a good reminder for those of us, because several of us have served on the committee since the beginning, of the full scope of the work that has taken on and the nature of the work, and to remind us that, you know, our work is directly servicing students out there. And then our next piece that we had was Word Farmers did an evaluation program, and Jamie Clifton shared with us the initial findings from the data for the intervener certificate program. There was a series of focus interviews that he had with participants, the instructors for the courses, as well as special guest lecturers. And they looked at overall program quality, the learning modality or the delivery method that we use for the program, of course, the content of the program, and then just some general, you know, pluses, minuses, barriers, and benefits to the program. So Jamie shared out a nice report, and that full data report will be coming out later this summer and definitely be available by early fall. Then our last piece of business today gave us a really good presentation that was prepared by Rich Van Voorhees and Kenneth Miller out of Youngstown State, and in particular out of their school psychology program. They have been working with Dean's Compact funds to work with school psychologist candidates and looking at how to prepare them to better work and support families who have students and children and even adults with low incidence disabilities. And so they talked about the research they had done, and they had research specific that was to the broad national community of school psychologists. Then they developed their questions and research around here in Ohio, and then specifically made some nice programs in addition to their program at Youngstown State, and shared out that information. And they're going to have some videos coming out that might be available for all of us to use as we think about school psychologists working with individuals who have low incidence disabilities, and in particular helping their families become resilient in the work that they do. That's where we are on our pieces. So that's my piece. If anybody else from my group wants to add anything, please do so at this time. If not, I'll pass it on to whoever wants to go next.
Okay. Sally, thank you so much. Low Incidence Committee and team, we really appreciate you folks for all that you're doing. Just a quick side note, if you look in the chat, Deb put in there the actual conference center address. So some of you obviously know where this is, like the back of your hand, but some of the new folks, that's a good one to take a quick shot of and store for you. So let's go on to our second group. Is there another group that would like to go next?
I'll go. It's Policy Committee.
Okay.
Okay, our meeting began by reviewing the Policy Committee video that's part of the Ohio Dean's Compact Video History Series. The committee members enjoyed the video and thought it was a good representation of what the Policy Committee does and has accomplished. We, though, think it would be a good idea to post the whole series and let our members know where they can view that entire series of videos. So our next topic that we discussed, or really the first topic we discussed, was the fact that we have a goal of increasing member diversity in the compact. The committee then reviewed the bylaws to determine if any changes might be needed to support a more diverse membership. One suggestion was to modify the membership section that indicates and have an indication there that the compact prioritizes a diverse membership. And that priority would be to ensure that there are diverse perspectives that come through in our meetings. And the suggestion is how to do it would be to add a number 3 under the membership section that states specifically that the compact prioritizes and encourages the appointment of members that support diversity of representation and perspectives, and then renumber what remains in that section. We didn't feel we could make a stronger statement than that because individual situations dictate who can be appointed, and so we wanted to make sure people understood that we were encouraging diverse membership. So the last issue that we discussed had to do with how to revise the RFA to reflect the goal of the grant being to create blended programs as opposed to dual programs. Dual programs kind of create the impression that gen ed and special ed are separate programs, and then you just put these two things together for a dual license. And that's not our intent. Our intent is to truly blend the knowledge and skills so that any one teacher can teach any child that appears in their classroom. So one of the first suggestions is to drop the use of the term dual license and begin using the term blended license. Again, using the term dual leads you to believe you have to complete both programs simultaneously, and this cannot be done in 4 years and can mean that IHEs would not want to even tackle getting it done. So further, the license would need to be called blended as opposed to dual. Another issue that needed to be addressed is that no new programs can be over 126 hours to be accepted and approved by the ODHE. So this can result in the creation of a program that satisfies the standards that are required, but going over the number of hours. And after all that work would be done to submit a program to the ODHE, it might not be approved just because of that 126-hour limit for new programs. So it needs to be stated in the RFE that the program must meet that hour requirement. It would be helpful for the ODHE to make clear what is required to be considered a blended program so that IHEs don't submit 2 programs put together as opposed to blending them. That was a constant theme in our discussion, that we don't want a gen ed and a special ed program. Let's just put them side by side and say we have a blended program. A way to support institutions in accomplishing this would be for the compact to assign a mentor or coach to help design the blended program. And this mentor could be a member who attends compact meetings or a designee of the compact, perhaps, the compact could keep a list of people that would be willing to do that work that would be approved by the compact. And further, the RFA could ask for a description of the process used to create the program so that we all understand what went on in making designing this new program. So looking to the future work of the compact, we really need to be willing to help advance the idea of one blended license for teachers. So all teachers have the training and the confidence to teach any student that is on their roster. Having two licenses creates the opposite impression. You got your gen ed students, you got your special ed students, and gen ed teachers can only teach gen ed and special ed can only teach special ed. And that is not where we want the future of this profession to be. So what we're doing now with the grants is a beginning step toward that goal. And given that students with disabilities need to have special instruction designed by a qualified person in Ohio, the goal is to make sure that all teachers are that qualified person. Currently, the state says that the qualified person is an intervention specialist or someone delivering related services. And while the IDEA permits more flexibility, Ohio does not. So we also need to get some legal guidance on how to proceed with that. Further, we need to address how to create a program for current teachers to have credentials to serve students with disabilities, much like there is a gifted endorsement. That's outside the grant process, but we talked about that and thought that was important to say. And it would also be helpful to create standards for a blended programs that IHEs can use in designing their programs. Crosswalks can help do this, but there really needs to be more of a seamless combination as opposed to that 1 and 1 makes 2 that I've talked about earlier. And this is, we concede that this is easier to do with the PK5 licenses, as adding content at the upper license creates a little more added issues. The bottom line is that it's recommended that the compact continue to advocate for blended licenses and help districts understand the application and use of these licenses. And to do this, we might be able to coordinate with the Ohio Council for Exceptional Children and work with the CEC to find ways to support newly licensed teachers in dealing with students with disabilities in their classrooms. But of course, that's you'd have to have a relationship with the CEC to do that, but we can still explore that, how to make that possible. And finally, the committee acknowledged Richard Welch's service on the compact and the policy committee as he is retiring, and this will be his last meeting. Richard has been a valuable member who really makes significant contributions to the success of both our committee and the compact as a whole. And the very last thing is I am also announcing my retirement, and I'll be retiring at the end of the summer. So this will be my last meeting. And if you hear from Deb Telfer, she might be asking you to be the chair of the policy committee because we're going to need a new one now. So that concludes my report. And if anybody have anything to add that I forgot or misrepresented or whatever.
You did a beautiful job, Deb, and thank you for all your work on Dean's Compact.
Deb, I thank you so much. Oh my gosh, you're one of those folks we can never replace. Thank you for all your work that you've done over the years. It's truly been wonderful. As well as shout out to Richard, right? Richard, thank you for all your help. Great having incredible veterans such as you are, and we know we're going to miss you dearly. So congratulations.
Thanks.
The next group, who would like to go? Jim, do you want to go?
Sure. Thanks, Mark. And kudos to Deb on retirement, although we hate to see both of you go, Deb and Richard. So thanks for your work. The dissemination committee had 3 tasks to address today. One involved the video series that Deb mentioned. We looked at, there's a video series of, I believe there are 7 videos that really focus on the work and the history of the Dean's Compact. And we reviewed or previewed the historical overview part 1. And then we also selected another one to look at, which was the policy video part 7. And the videos are very, very well done. So whoever did them kudos, good work on the videos. The purpose of the preview was to kind of brainstorm ideas from the dissemination committee in terms of, you know, some strategies to get the word out about the work of the committee to both IHEs and other partners across Ohio and nationally. So, you know, what can we do to make sure that folks know about the Dean's Compact and their work, and what strategies can we use to get the work out? So we have quite a few suggestions that I'll summarize in notes and share with you, Deb, but some of them involved working with groups within Ohio. Others involved the national stage. You know, many of us get out and do presentations at national conferences. And one of the thoughts that came out of that discussion is, as a part of our getting out and doing that work, a part of that presentation could be making sure people across the nation know about the work of the Dean's Compact. There was also a lot of strategies that had to do with social media. In today's world, people get information about work of different organizations through social media. So one of the suggestions would be to increase our social media footprint. And if the budget allows, possibly engaging a marketer that would just focus on marketing the work of the Dean's Compact to a variety of groups in Ohio and outside of Ohio. There was also some discussion about the Dean's Compact and what we can do to let folks know that the Dean's Compact is not just for deans, it's an inclusive group. The initial talk was from someone who said, when I was asked to join the Dean's Compact, I thought, well, I'm not a dean, should I really be there? Well, the Dean's Compact is more inclusive than just deans. So perhaps we can get a tagline that pulls that together, that makes folks know that the Dean's Compact is a very inclusive group. Bottom line, though, is the videos were very well received. We think they're a great marketing tool, and we do have some strategies that can be used for conferences, like using a QR code and some screenshots to make people aware of those videos. Those videos will be posted on the newly restructured Dean's Compact site, I believe in September. So that was the first piece. The second item that we were tasked to do was to look at some possible speakers for the Dean's Compact meetings, quarterly meetings, and for the conference that'll be held in January. So we did identify some of the speakers from the list that we were provided for the quarterly meetings and the annual conference. And we also will offer a couple of other suggestions for your consideration. But Deb and the core committee that identifies the speakers for these quarterly meetings, what a great job you have done. I mean, yesterday's session was just awesome. So kudos to you and your work. The third area that we focused on was possible action forums for 22-23. We would like to continue with a literacy action forum. And also the do work is very important as well. We need to keep that front and center. I again will take everything that was mentioned in our meeting and reduce it to notes, send it to our committee on Monday after our committee looks at it and makes adjustments. Deb will send that to you. Anybody else from the committee, anything else to add? A shout out to Laura Saylor for saving the day with my lack of technical skills today. Carol and I are really good at working with Zoom and sharing, screen sharing and so on and so forth. But for some reason, with this group, I have difficulty. So thanks, Laura. Appreciate it. That's it, Mark.
Okay, Jim, thank you, as well as thank you to the dissemination committee. Great job again. A lot of good ideas. Barb, would you like to go?
I am ready. The Impact Evaluation Committee. As I was thinking about how to just summarize what we discussed, I think we talked about the history, the success, the challenges, and the future of the Dean's Compact. We did review some completed evaluation studies that have been made, and I'll just briefly touch on those, and a document that's being developed. So it was a very, very interesting discussion. I'm sure that these reports will be available for all of us, but I'll just highlight what their purposes were. The first one was a review of the process of the incentive grants. And those institutions who have worked through it and who are actually implementing the program. Just one highlight from it, I would just point out that the study included 10 different institutions and the work that they've done. They have established and maintained them. So we talked about some of the challenges that people faced in working through that, and the advantages of course of dual licensure, and how that how that impacts our candidates out in the field as they're seeking employment. So we reviewed that study, the process of the incentive grant. Overall, it was, I think, a very positive report that certainly provides some examples for people to follow. We touched briefly on the journal, the dedication journal that will be dedicated to the diversification of the educator workforce. We are moving along with that and still on target to have that published. So we're kind of in a holding pattern, but we are ready and prepared whenever the word comes down that it's our turn. So that is, I think, there's no doubt that's going to happen. The third one that we probably spent the most time on was the report around the current and future direction of the Ohio Dean's Compact. And the person who helped us review, if you will, some of the findings was Dr. Carissa Schutzman from the University of Cincinnati, from the Evaluation Center. And so she kind of talked us through that. It was, I would imagine many of you in some way participated in the one of the focus groups that we all participated, the core team, community of practice, the committee chairs, the compact members, representatives from P20 were involved, and we participated in a great discussion with an identified list of questions that we all had a little bit of time to talk about. So the study itself, the actual document is lengthy, as it should be, because we've done a lot of work over the years. And so the groups each had great insight into things that they shared. The actual study, as I said, is lengthy, but Carissa shared an infographic that I think will be a great summary of the study. And our committee actually, I don't know what authority we have, but we're making a recommendation that we would like to have the results of this study shared at our September meeting in some fashion that makes sense with the agenda. It's just so well done, and I think just kind of sets everything in motion as to where we've been, where we are, and where we're going. And we talked about succession of leadership, how we need to, continue to be thinking about all of that and what that means. So again, we had great discussion, and we're hoping that as the agenda gets planned for September, that that this can be included. We just think that it's so well done that people need to hear it. The final thing that we talked about and kind of reviewed, Crystal Day is sort of leading, although she's there are others helping her as well, to create a resource guide for institutions who are wanting to write or to start inclusive practices and how they might go about doing it. I think it will be a great guideline for people who either are involved and want to see, well, maybe we should have done this and perhaps we left that out, or, oh, here's what we need to do next. I think it's just it will be a very fine document in terms of program planning and the awareness stage all the way to implementation and how to sustain it. So she's, as I said, she and others are working on that. So we look forward to that becoming available. But we did have very good discussion, and I would invite anyone else on the committee who wants to share something else to please do so. It was a good discussion. I don't want to leave out anything that you might think should have been mentioned. So please feel free if you'd like to jump in.
Barb, this is Crystal Day. I just wanted to say, just a point of clarification. The resource that we're developing is for blended program redesign. So for institutions who are interested in developing inclusive preparation programs.
Good clarification. Thank you. Okay, I think that's all we have, Mark. You're muted, Mark.
Yeah, isn't that amazing? You would think after how many years? Barb, thank you so much as usual. And thank you again for the Impact Evaluation Committee for all your work. Great stuff and absolutely a wonderful idea. I agree with Deb to go ahead and bring that out into one of our times that we have for Dean's Compact is great, and people need to see that great work. So wonderful. Our last group, but not least, Jennifer, you're on with the community of practice.
Thanks, Mark, and good morning, everyone. Today, we heard from two of our grant teams about the work in which they're engaged and how they're really being intentional about the collaborative efforts of their projects. So we first heard from the iEducate Consortium, which is a 5 IHE partnership focused on diversifying the educator workforce. And in their presentation, they shared some of the experiences of their members regarding building and sustaining a collaborative team. And from that presentation, 2 themes that kind of emerged were that they stayed a collaborative team because of their experience as a community of care, and their collective creation maintains their solidarity because they're sharing workloads and resources. In their group, some of that community of care, there was love, trust, and respect, and some of that came through in the follow-up discussion of the other members of the community of practice, and how they're really working together to move forward equity, which their collaborative teaming and how they're working together helps to make the work a little less overwhelming, which helps to alleviate a threat to the work not being sustainable. And so there was a comment that really resonated with me, and it was, we don't have all the skills, but we don't need to. I need to understand what my role is and then to do my role well. Because when we're working as a team, that gives that space to allow that to happen. It allows us to not feel like we're doing the work alone, but it allows us to really work together to make sure that we have time to reflect and to take care of ourselves as we're engaging in the hard work that equity is. I think just again to highlight that first presentation really brought home that importance of sustainability and how although we're really action oriented and are diversifying the educator workforce, teams are making these models and implementing the modules, they're actually doing the work. There also needs to be time built into the current systems and into the models that they're designing that allows for members to learn and to reflect so that they can continue in the work in a meaningful way. And then we also heard from Peggy Schauer at John Carroll, who really spoke about the importance of identifying early champions of the work, both in our institutions and in our communities, including those individuals who have institutional knowledge and who have access to the decision makers if they themselves aren't the decision makers. And so we need to learn who those individuals are, who can open the door for us, who can connect us with those individuals who have influence and who do make the decisions. And if there's a door that's not opening, kind of keep pushing until not to take an initial no, but to come back and ask again and to just continue to create opportunities to have some space with the individuals who are making decisions, to just keep trying and to make sure we're having those elevator speeches ready, because we never know when we'll have an opportunity to talk with someone about our work. And if someone asks how we're doing, not just saying fine, but to use it as an opportunity to elevate the work that we're doing, to talk about the project and something current that's going on, and bringing it back to our candidates, to keep telling the stories of our candidates and giving our candidates themselves the opportunity to tell their story, to empower them to tell their own stories, including in front of the decision makers. So 2 institutions, teams, they shared how their candidates actually have prepared, practiced, and presented in front of leaders of the institutions, and how that has been something that has created change. And so the candidates, they've been excited, and it really gave them a chance to feel seen. At the same time, across both of these presentations, something that really resonated was the importance of leadership, and even some opportunities for growth in leadership. And so making sure our leaders can practice listening and not always needing to have something necessarily to say, but whenever they're with certain individuals, just to practice listening. Another team had shared, just the important, like their leaders realizing the importance of going into the community and showing interest in students from the community and meeting prospective students and taking that initiative on and taking that first step. I think I'll stop there and open it up to other community of practice facilitators or members. If there's anything else you want to add, you're welcome to. All right, thanks, Mark.
All right, Jennifer, thank you so much. And again, thank you for all the communities of practice. Very much appreciated. In fact, folks, in all the groups, all 5 of the groups that we have, working groups, just a wonderful amount of great work being done. I know I can speak for Tichelle and Deb that we so much appreciate your effort and energies on this because it is a lot of work but a lot of great stuff comes out of it. So thank you all very much. Folks, we are into where we get to actually meet and spend some time with Dr. Tyrone Howard again, but I want to make sure he's ready to go. Dr. Howard, are you with us?
I am with you. Good morning, everyone. How's everyone doing?
It is great to have you back. Thank you again. I just want to have a quick little statement here. Those of you who weren't here yesterday and had missed, just Dr. Howard gave an incredible talk yesterday about closing the achievement gap, what school districts and institutions of higher ed can do. He is a professor of education at the University of California, UCLA. And the School of Education and Information Studies. He's also president-elect of American Education Research Association, or AERA. Again, we are really fortunate to have Dr. Howard with us. So Dr. Howard, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Mark. It's good to be back with you all this fine Friday morning. I hope you all are well, and it's good to just listen in on the last part of your community of practice and some of the work that you all are engaged in, that you're doing. And it's always good to hear that there's some synergy between what we're doing in different parts of the country all around trying to close gaps, respond to our most vulnerable students, sort of lift the floor so we can continue to see progress for our students. So I want to thank you all for the discussions yesterday. I was fortunate enough to hear from a number of folks via email with some additional questions. So I appreciate the feedback and the engagement. And so I want to use today in my time with you just to really kind of talk about where we go from here and some additional steps we need to think about as we think about closing gaps. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen real quick because I think, you know, in many ways we know the challenges that are facing us. So the question becomes, what steps do we take? How do we begin to catalyze our resources and use our best efforts in a way that we can work smarter and not necessarily harder around some of these issues? Because sometimes I think what we fall prey to in education is that there's a lot of different things happening. And the left hand oftentimes doesn't know what the right hand is doing. And we have to think about more efficient systems and ways of doing the work that we do around equity and opportunity gaps, et cetera. So before I get started, I want to highlight a few resources that tie into what I talked about yesterday. One was about our educator diversity efforts. I direct the Center for the Transformation of Schools here at UCLA. And in our one of our most recent reports that came out just a few months ago, we talked about ways we can prioritize educator diversity. And I think what was, we're funded by the Gates and Hewlett Foundations. And what we're basically doing, and I would imagine some similar arrangement is in place there in the state of Ohio, is trying to utilize state dollars, county dollars, and LEA dollars to begin to really put an intentional focus on diversifying our educator workforce. We have seen, and again, I don't know the context specifically there in Ohio, but we have seen a number of different incentives that are prioritizing collaboration, where we are trying to find ways to connect LEAs with districts and community colleges and universities around with teacher education programs. Here in California, our community colleges are in many ways a sleeping giant, because what we find is that the overwhelming majority of our students of color who pursue post-secondary education do so at two-year colleges. Yet what does not happen in a very intentional way is a connection or conduit between community colleges, teacher prep programs, and universities to begin to do some of that work we talked about yesterday about finding a way to sort of strengthen that pipeline to have some of our students of color contemplate teaching as a career field. We also see here in California, counties have lots of oversight and lots of funding around how they can help develop clear guidance for LEAs on how to develop funding streams. So I think in many ways, we as schools of education, departments of ed, we are constantly trying to put our heads together around what can be done, what should be done to increase diversity in our teaching ranks. But at some point, we have to be mindful of the fact that we cannot do it alone, and leaning on our states, leaning on our counties, and leaning and working in collaboration with our districts and LEAs can be a really, really good start in the right direction. So we're going to continue to do this work, and I'll continue to keep you abreast of where we're going in terms of some of our work there around educator diversity. The other thing I wanted to mention, because I closed yesterday talking about issues around school discipline, and I wanted to, again, offer another resource. Myself and several colleagues had the opportunity 2 years ago to do a comprehensive report on suspending our future that really got into a lot of the particularities around suspensions here in the state of California. I know I kind of picked on Ohio yesterday, but if I'm just being totally transparent, California is no better when it comes to some of the data around school suspensions. And in this report, myself and Frank Harris and Luke Wood, we identify a list of different strategies, practices, recommendations, and even policy implications that can be essential in terms of moving us in the right direction to reducing school suspensions, keeping kids engaged. And some of it's just rewriting some of our education codes around school discipline. Some of it is providing ongoing support and training for our teachers who don't know how to cultivate those relationships with students that we know can reduce the likelihood of student referral. So in this report, which you can look up just by typing in Suspending Our Future, you see a host of recommendations. We have 2 of them. Suspending Our Future is the second report. The first one is called Get Out, which talks about, again, how we can begin to think about statewide policies that would eliminate suspension from preschools, engaging social workers for any young person who is in the foster care system before any type of suspension. So we offer a lot of tangible kinds of steps that can be taken that can help school leaders think about issues around discipline and punishment. The discipline and punishment issue, I think, really segues nicely into what I want to get into this morning, because what I didn't really touch upon much yesterday as an equity issue, as an achievement gap issue, is the issues that we are still seeing that are tied to COVID-19. So much of what we're still doing, thinking about, talking about is tied to this COVID moment. There have been folks who have talked about the fact that as we are post-COVID, and whenever I hear that term, I kind of cringe, because the last time I checked, I didn't think we were post-COVID yet. I thought we were still in the midst of the pandemic. Are we in a better place than we were 2 years ago? I believe so, but we're not out of the woods. But what we're starting to see now is some really troubling data that comes as no surprise to anyone. And when I think about that, I think about the fact that there was a report that came out from the U.S. Surgeon General at the end of last year that talked about the effect of COVID on the social emotional well-being of our students. I think as we think about preparing teachers, this issue around student social emotional well-being has to be front and center now, because so much of what we're seeing now in terms of the levels of youth stress, depression, anxiety, aggression, violence, a number of mental health experts are attributing that to issues tied to COVID-19. And by and large, this has not been a big focal part of what we do in terms of teacher preparation or leadership preparation. There oftentimes a much more sort of surface level manner in which we engage in social emotional well-being. There's oftentimes a very surface level analysis of how we think about student mental health. And I think it's really starting to lead us to a big conversation that's needed around mental health. Yesterday, as you all know, I talked about that we have this ambivalence around discussing race for a variety of reasons. I would raise a similar contention that we have a similar ambivalence around talking mental health. And I don't think we can talk about education. I don't think we can move into talking about changing systems and supporting the most adverse student populations without having real hard, sustained conversations around mental health. But what makes that challenging, as you all know, is that by and large, we as a society have such a difficult time addressing mental health. And a lot of it is rooted in the fact that we don't know how to talk about mental health, most of us, unless you're trained in this area. Most of us were taught not to even acknowledge issues around mental health. We don't have the skills, the tools, or resources, by and large, to address mental health. I think if we don't think more strategically and systematically about how our teacher preparation programs, how our leadership programs and how our overall course of study take a much more clear and intentional focus around mental health and student well-being, that we will be missing a huge need that is present in schools across our country in this moment. Now, I raise that because one of the big parts of the current discourse has been really rooted in this idea that there has been significant learning loss among students. The academic slide, we all know that. And states across the country, much to my chagrin, have been in this mad dash to say, how do we make up for the learning loss? How do we close these gaps that have gotten wider during the course of the pandemic? And I understand and I realize the need for us to begin to address their learning loss. However, I am of the opinion that we cannot and we will not get to the learning loss if we don't prioritize students' mental health. Because as you all know, and the data has been clear for a very long time, when students are suffering from depression, learning is severely compromised. When students are suffering from anxiety, comprehension is very compromised. When students are in deep mourning, grief because of loss, the levels of engagement are compromised. I mean, the data is abundantly clear that if students are not well, learning is much more challenging to take place. So we need to begin to ask ourselves, what are the supports we're putting in place to help our student teachers, to help our students across the board begin to remove that stigma that's associated with mental health. And really, it comes to a larger conversation that is necessary and long overdue. But I think one of the reasons why we don't have this conversation is because by and large, we have deemed mental health in this country, sort of generally speaking, as something of a sign of weakness that people have, something that seems to be inadequate about who people are. We tend to look at mental health as meaning you are, quote unquote, the word that's oftentimes used, crazy. There's a lot of really deficit and pathologizing ways in which we deem mental health in this country. That has to stop. And I think we, as leaders, can start to initiate conversations, bringing in experts to talk about what are the signs of mental health, what are the resources available to respond to mental health, because if we don't, we're not going to be able to meet the needs of our students. I raise that in this conversation because what we do know is even prior to the pandemic, before the pandemic started, one of the things that we would oftentimes talk to our pre-service teachers about was the adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, which I'm sure maybe you are familiar with. Many of our young people in our programs were not as familiar with the adverse child experiences. So what we started to do is ensure that everyone in our programs read the work on adverse child experiences. And for those who are not as familiar, basically it talks about these issues that affect young people that can carry on into adulthood and can have a paralyzing effect on people's cognitive development, social emotional well-being, and the like. This has changed in lots of ways, the ways our pre-service candidates go into the school, because they understand that these issues are all too real in communities across the board: urban, rural, suburban, affluent, middle class, lower income, but yet we don't talk about them. So let me give you a little bit of insight about just these first two areas here that I think are important for us to think about in our programs moving forward. So for example, when you think about physical, emotional, sexual abuse and physical, emotional neglect, those are the two primary reasons why most children end up in Child Protective Services. It's also important to note that educators are the primary source of individuals who refer children to Child Protective Services. Now, here's what we know. During the course of the pandemic, there was about a 60% decrease, 60% decrease in the number of children who are referred to Child Protective Services. So on the surface, one hears that and think, wow, that's a great thing. The fact that there was a significant drop in the number of children who were reported for suspected abuse and or neglect. But now what we are learning is that that decrease that we saw during the first year of the pandemic in particular was really misleading, because the 60% decrease in reporting was not necessarily because there was fewer cases of abuse and neglect. It was because young people or students, by and large, were not in the presence of teachers, and teachers are the #1 reporters. So in all likelihood, what we're now learning across the board nationally is that while there was a 60% decrease in the number of children who were reported to Child Protective Services, In all likelihood, now child welfare advocates and experts are saying that there was probably close to about a 50% increase in the cases of abuse and neglect during the pandemic. So I need us to be mindful of what that means for a second. We saw a 60% decrease in reports, but in all actuality, it was probably about a 50% increase because we know that there were a host of stressors that occurred during the pandemic. We know that families were in close proximity with one another during the pandemic. Anytime there are economic downturns or any disruption of our sense of normalcy, a lot of adults and parents and caregivers' coping mechanisms aren't as strong as they might need to be. So what we saw were young people, what we're seeing now, young people who were facing some really severe circumstances, and we're now seeing the manifestations of that in schools. So what we need to do is begin to talk to our teachers in training and our in-service teachers about the ACEs, how they manifest itself, understanding mental illness of caregivers and adults. We also know that during the course of the pandemic, there was an increase nationwide in substance abuse, increase in alcohol abuse. We know there was an increase in parental separation and divorce. There was an increase in domestic violence. So when you look at the adverse child experiences that were in place, again, for many of our young people before the pandemic, in many of their households across the country, these issues became even significantly more challenging. So any educator who's going to walk into schools today, no matter what the composition of their school, needs to be mindful of what the adverse child experiences are, how they have an impact on young people, how it influences their behavior, how we must not, and this is important, how we must not refer to punitive measures when young people are behaving in particular ways. Because I maintain that we have to have a sort of a framework that helps our educators to recognize that behavior is oftentimes the language from many of our students who are in need of help. And what we typically do is that the students who have some of the more severe needs that we should be pulling closer to us and getting additional supports and services, we tend to push them away and make those situations even more challenging. Thank you, Susan, so much, because one of my favorite books is Dr. Nadine Burke Harris's book, The Deepest Well. Every educator, I think every educator should read The Deepest Well because it gives you a look into some of the real sort of adverse circumstances that lots of students are going through. I also think a book by Susan Craig called Trauma Informed Classrooms in School is another must read because again, what we're finding is that teachers who know their content well, who understand their subject matter well, who understand pedagogy well, oftentimes are really sort of ill-equipped to deal with the challenges that students have if they don't understand the effects that adverse childhood experiences have on our young people. This has got to be not just a one-time conversation in our programs, but something we talk about across the board. I raise that because there's some deeply troubling data that looks at the increasing rates of childhood depression, of childhood anxiety, and like I mentioned, childhood anger. But there was a really deeply troubling report that came out just last year from the Center for Disease Control that talked about the steady rise in youth suicide during the pandemic. And this is something that, again, requires our time, attention, focus, and effort. Our refusal to talk about mental health within our programs, youth mental health in our programs, in many ways will contribute to the stigmatization of mental health that is leading to some troubling data. The CDC's report last year showed that there's youth death by suicide is up across the board for all groups. But there were 4 groups in particular that have had higher rates of death by suicide than others. And I think this is the kind of data we need to be talking about in our programs so that as we're doing this work with schools, we're not sort of overlooking some of the more critical factors. The number one group that had significantly higher death by suicide rates over the past 3 years have been boys ages 10 to 24. Now, I think this warrants a deeper conversation. Why are boys here? Why do boys have the highest suicide rates in youth suicide rates over the past 2 years? Well, much of that is rooted in this idea that as a society, we don't give boys the permission to feel. We raise boys in the sort of the context of what is referred to as what Sean Harper refers to as toxic masculinity. If you think about how we send these messages to boys at young ages, we say things like boys don't cry, boys have to be tough, boys have to man up. Those are really disturbing messages to send to young boys at a time when lots of boys are going through, like all other children, going through deep-seated, suffering, trauma, sadness, grief, confusion, you name it, right? It is important for us to talk to educators in training and in service about how we create spaces that allows boys the permission to feel, to say, if I have to cry, it's okay. If I'm angry, I can express my anger in ways that are productive and not destructive. If I am just not feeling well and I don't know why I'm not feeling well, that's okay. We have to start talking to all of our students, but in particular, our young boys, about the ways in which it's okay for them to be able to express the full range of human emotions. I maintain, and this is what the data bears out, the data tells us that boys and girls have suicidal ideations at similar levels. But two things happen. Girls are more likely to talk to somebody, which means that it decreases the likelihood that they'll try to do self-harm and do self-harm. Boys are more likely to keep things in, which will lead them to harmful kinds of behaviors. The other thing we find out is that girls are just as likely to attempt suicide. Boys are more likely to complete suicide, meaning that they tend to take much more violent kind of steps to self-harm, which frequently results in their death. This is, I think, a bigger issue than we are giving it in our society. If we do not talk about the way we begin to eradicate toxic masculinity, talk about gender dynamics in our society, give our teachers and principals the skills to be able to support our boys, these numbers will continue to rise, sadly. The second group are our LGBTQ+ youth. Now, again, prior to the pandemic, we know there was an increasing amount of data around the experiences of our LGBTQ+ youth. A wonderful resource that everyone should read is called the Gay Straight Lesbian Education Network data, GSLEN, Gay Straight Lesbian Education Network. It is the largest database in our country around the experiences of our LGBTQ+ youth. And that report, which I think surveys close to 7,000 students, is deeply, deeply troubling. It speaks to the level of homophobia that exists in our schools and classrooms. It speaks to the level of transphobia that exists in our schools and classrooms. One of the big issues that we as schools of education have to begin to think about and talk about and do something about is that the gender discussions that are happening in schools are deeply troubling. There are more young people who are coming to us who are expressing the fact that they feel like their gender identity is not recognized, not affirmed. We are continuing to kind of put kids in these very sort of narrow boxes in terms of how they think about themselves, in terms of their gender identity. It is important for us, if we look at some of the students who are among the most marginalized in our schools, please hear me out. The students who are among the most marginalized in our schools, they are our LGBTQ+ youth. Because not only can school be a difficult place, the unfortunate reality that for many of these young people, home can also be a difficult place. And during the course of the pandemic, what we are finding out is that many of our LGBTQ+ youth were not able to have outlets with peers and friends and school members, teachers, counselors who were supportive of them. Like I mentioned, sometime we are learning, and we've known this for some time, family members can be some of the most abusive and harmful to our LGBTQ+ youth. We need to start talking about what are we doing to put in supports? How do we begin to have conversations with our teachers in training, with our leaders in training to ensure that they are safe, brave spaces to support our LGBTQ+ youth. There are some researchers who have said that current projections around youth suicide shows that LGBTQ+ youth may soon pass boys as the #1 group of young people who are engaging in self-harm. Requires us to not remain silent. Staying silent around issues tied to mental health in many ways will make us complicit in the perpetuation of these issues that are affecting far too many young people. And then the last two groups, which require a much larger conversation, are Black and Latinx students. Now, what's interesting about Black and Latinx students in terms of why they are here is because what the data tells us is that by and large, in Black and Latinx communities, issues around mental health are kind of seen as cultural taboos. And I can speak about this as someone who is part of the African-American community. When I grew up, you didn't talk about mental health. Mental health was not seen as a real thing. I remember my mother telling me years ago, therapy is for white people. Black people don't go to therapy. Now, where she got that or how she got that, I will never know. But there are cultural taboos. There are deep-seated beliefs around religion in many communities of color that says that we will go to church, we will go to mass, we'll pray on things, and that's fine. I believe in prayer, but at the same time, you can pray and get help. So we need to talk about mental health and what it means in communities of color. We need to begin to talk about the importance of therapy. There's a big need for us, even for some Black and brown folks who do decide to get therapy, there's a big divide in terms of diversity in the rank of folks who provide mental health supports. So we need to have more therapists of color, more counselors of color, because for some of our young people who are from diverse backgrounds, there's a preference to be able to see someone who can relate to them culturally, ethnically, and racially. So these groups right here are a big group of students that we will see and we do see in our schools. And then when you begin to look at this from an intersectional standpoint, think about our Black and brown boys who are also members of the LGBTQ+ community. The ACEs scores begin to rise significantly, and it speaks to some challenges that we face in our schools. So what we must do, because I get teachers who tell me, well, you're asking me to be a social worker now. No, I'm not asking you to be a social worker. I'm asking us as educators to be mindful and aware of the challenge that students bring from home. One of my biggest go-tos, I think every teacher preparation program, every leadership preparation program in the nation should know about onedegree.org. Onedegree.org is a phenomenal resource. It's a national database that gives you a host of different resources that exist within various counties and cities and jurisdictions across the country. Frequently what happens is that teachers don't know what supports exist in a particular area. Principals and leaders may not know what supports exist in a particular area. You go to onedegree.org, you type in your city, you type in your zip code, and you get a host of different resources that are tied to financial resources, employment training opportunities, housing resources, mental health supports. It's for parents, for youth, for immigrants, you name it, there are sources. Part of what we struggle from is just this knowledge gap of not knowing where to go for certain types of information. We have to ensure now that at a time where we do, in my humble opinion, a really poor job of putting mental health supports in place in our schools, that now our practitioners and leaders have something at their fingertips. What really deeply troubles me is, and you all have probably seen this in Ohio, I've gone to schools here in California. I was at a school just, what was that, 3 weeks ago, large urban comprehensive middle school, 900 students they had at the school. I asked, how many social workers do you have? They said they had one. One social worker for 900 students is not sufficient. A big high school that's a couple of miles away from that, I visited them a few months back. They have 2,400 students they have there. How many social workers do you have? We have 2 social workers. So we're not putting enough social workers, and we're not putting enough counselors and therapists in schools, which essentially means that the work that professionals who are trained to deal with students who are dealing with different kinds of mental health challenges now falls on educators and leaders, many of whom have not been trained, many of whom are not prepared, and many of them who are not aware of signs, and most of whom do not know resources that exist in their communities that can help not just our students, but also the parents. I raised the parent issue because much of our work has got to be about families now, because again, the effects of the pandemic not only affected our young people, they affected entire families. And so now we see parents. There was a phenomenal article written in the Atlantic last year titled "The Parents Are Not Okay," meaning that many of the adults really struggled during the pandemic and are not oftentimes in their best positions to be able to support their young people. So we're not just finding supports for our students. It's a much more comprehensive need that we have to be mindful as well. So onedegree.org is a powerful resource. I really encourage you to check it out and use it and share it widely with the folks that you can. Yes, and that health tab, depending on what your jurisdiction is, your county, the health is broad. It's not only medical support, but it's also mental health. The challenge is this though, and I want to just be very upfront with you about this. What we are finding here in California, and I've heard the same thing to be the case in states across the country, even once we can get folks to agree to get mental health supports, the access to mental health is so daunting in some of our communities that we are hearing that families are having to wait up to 2-3 months before they can even see a therapist. That doesn't help a child who's in crisis now. That doesn't help a family who needs intervention immediately. So as much as we are talking about the need to recognize the importance of mental health, B, taking the step to get help for mental health, C, the biggest issue is the access so that families are not waiting weeks and weeks and weeks at a time before they are finally able to see someone who can be of assistance. But again, this is the new normal. We are seeing more young people who are coming to our schools who are exhibiting behaviors that suggest that something may not be well, something may not be right. Our goal is not to ask what is wrong with that student. I think there's a different question we should be asking is what may have happened to that student. Very fundamentally different question, which gives a different kind of reaction of how we respond. Mental health matters, mental health matters, mental health matters. If we are not prioritizing this, we are missing out on a huge, huge, huge need that our students have. I think in this moment, our mantra has been, and I've been kind of on a one-person crusade around this, is that we need to put Maslow before Bloom. Maslow before Bloom. We all remember Teacher Education 101. We learned about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that when students' basic needs are not met, food, safety, security, connectedness, love, belongingness, that you're not going to get to Bloom's taxonomy. We have to help prepare professionals who walk into classrooms who understand that essential needs, that many students show up who have not had a decent meal to eat because food insecurities are still a big challenge in communities across our country. We need to walk into classrooms and understand that issues around homelessness are real. There are close to 1.8 million students who are experiencing homelessness that we know of. So again, we have students who are living in cars, shelters, motels. We also need to know that issues around mental health are tied to all those factors as well. So again, Maslow before Bloom, that needs to be at the very fundamentally sort of basic level of what we do to ensure that our professional educators in training or those who are in the work are having these conversations. I'll say this again before I move on. Our silence around issues tied to mental health make us complicit in the perpetuation of the problem. Folks don't like when I say that, but I can't say it any other way. We can no longer remain silent about this. Mental health affects millions upon millions of people in this country. We can't take something that is so prevalent and somehow sweep it under the rug as if it will disappear. If our programs and our preparation and our credentials are not putting a focus and intentionality on this, again, we're missing a huge opportunity to be able to support our students. Let me stop there to see if I have any questions or comments or disagreements on this issue, because I think it's so important for us to have this conversation.
I think pushback I hear a lot is that there is just so much we need to fit into any teacher ed program, state requirements, licensure requirements, that there's just not room. So Krista, could you just fit that whole conversation into your one class, please?
Yep. There you go. I've heard the same thing, Krista, that there's so much we're already asking teacher ed programs to do. They're already compacted. All the different credentialing requirements, the certification requirements, where does this fit? I've seen programs here that offer as an add-on, come to one Saturday out the semester to get a crash course. That's not enough, folks. It's just not. This is too important for us to marginalize.
I think one of the challenges that we face is in really preparing our pre-service educators to support children's mental health issues is that our students are coming to us with their own mental health issues. And it is epidemic proportions. So it becomes cyclical, how do we prepare our students?
Yeah, so thank you, Kimberly. So you're spot on, because part of the challenge is, here's the thing. There are layers to this, and I'm so glad you raised that, because what we find, there was a report that came out from the U.S. Department of Education that over almost 2/3 of education school alumni felt that they were not prepared to cope with their classroom realities. We're talking about the kids not being well, but the reality is a lot of our students are not well. And we don't know how to sort of respond to them not being well, because most of us don't have the tools and the resources. And if I could go one step further, many of us are not well because it's been hard for us. So you talk about we're running the programs, we're engaging with our students who are going through their own traumas, they're then having to engage with students. So you're talking about 3 levels of sort of unexamined mental health awareness. And part of what happens is that the mental health topic is one we're just afraid to talk about because we don't want to say the wrong thing. We don't want to do the wrong thing. We don't want to ask certain questions because that may be triggering. I mean, I'll give you this example, and this is maybe not the best example. How many times have you asked someone how they're doing, kind of in a perfunctory way, and they really tell you how they're doing, and they give you far more than you ever thought you bargained for? You think, wow, I didn't think I wanted to hear all that, because we're just kind of unsure what to do when people kind of dump on us or really kind of emote with us. And so we need to think about what are our supports in our own departments, in our own programs, because many of our colleagues, many of us are still trying to deal with the effects of what the last 2 years has meant to us. And I think we have to at least start having those conversations within the context of our courses and our programs. And what we cannot do, and this is what happens frequently when it comes to mental health conversations, and some of you probably can relate to this, you know, it takes a lot of courage for someone to open up and talk about what they're going through. But what we tend to do is we tend to, have you ever had a situation where you tell somebody what you're struggling with, what you're going through, and then they tell you what you think that's bad, you think that's hard? Let me tell you what I have to go through. We kind of play this sort of minimizing of other people's experiences because it's not ours, or we think we had to go through so much more. We have students who are struggling with financial aid issues, you know, living situations. Many of our students may be parents. They're taking care of older, you know, family members, parents. So the pressures that they feel just from life are a lot on top of what they're doing with school. And I think it's important for us to begin to identify on our campuses what are the supports. I will say this about my campus. We have a counseling and psychological services program that I have referred many students to. But I talked to our director, she says it has never been this bad, where she said that there are more students who are asking to be seen than she has seen in her 20 years of being here. And she feels awful because they are short-staffed. Students are having to wait up to 5-6 weeks at a time. And so she says, it's like triage. There are people who are really struggling, who are really suffering. We know they need help. We want to get them help, but we just can't get to them in the kind of immediate fashion. Talk to us, Susan.
So I think we as teacher educators and all higher ed educators have to have the same kind of understanding that we're talking about here. Trauma doesn't stop in 12th grade. In fact, there's another interesting book on my shelf that talks about issues of trauma into college. And yes, I know our curriculum is full and where do we fit this in, but we have to model it. We have to model strategies for building relationships. We have to talk about the importance, and we have to be willing to build those relationships with our students, because if we don't model it as educators, we'll never get to the point where our teacher candidates embrace it, try it out, and value it.
Amen. I mean, I could not agree more. I think you're right. I think it requires us being vulnerable. You know, even like, so look, I'm a huge advocate of therapy. I go to therapy regularly. I have for years. Even when I say things like I'm going to see my therapist, I get people who will look at me and say, is everything okay? Is there something wrong? We have kind of sort of socialized people, adults, to think that therapy is a bad thing. But I think we have to talk about our own sort of challenges and vulnerabilities to model in the way that you just highlighted, Susan, so that our candidates see it as being okay, that it's a sign of strength to get help. It's not a sign of weakness. We have to flip that whole thing on its head so that we have candidates who begin to think that it's okay. If they believe to normalize that it's okay, they can in turn begin to have those same conversations with their students. We have to start to socialize an entire generation of young people to understand that talking about your mental health is not a bad thing. I think that today's group of young people are much better than we are, right? And I think, and we are much better than our previous generation, but we still have a long way to go, because I refer to mental health as the invisible disability in many ways, right? If I break my arm, I come in, I've got a cast on. Everyone knows that I've got something wrong with me. But guess what? With mental health, you can't always see it. If I'm depressed, you can't see it. If I'm suffering from anxiety, you can't see it. If I've got paranoid schizophrenia, you can't see it. And my behaviors are such that people don't understand. And so it's that disconnect of information that continues to cause the problem to be even worse. And we have to do what Susan just said, we have to model it.
I have all of my students take the ACEs inventory. Of course, we don't don't share scores, but we talk about it because as young adults, they are just as vulnerable.
Yep.
Issues associated with ACEs, the physiological changes in the brain, and those reactions to high stress as the kids they are going to teach.
Yep. It's ironic you mentioned that. I've done the same thing the last 3. I didn't do it during COVID, but my students were blown away at how high their ACEs scores were. And I think that speaks to the ways in which we as adults learn how to normalize our trauma. We don't think it's anything abnormal, but we don't share our scores. But I've had students come to me one-on-one or who have emailed me that I have an ACEs score of 7 or 8, and I didn't realize how much unresolved trauma I had. And here's the point we have to be mindful of. You all know the saying, if we don't help our candidates deal with some of their challenges, they will walk into classrooms with students who have their own challenges. And you all know the saying, hurt people hurt people. And so though well-intended, if people don't have their issues resolved, they can walk into classrooms and do significant harm to children or engage in very triggering type of behavior with students that will make the situation much worse. So we have to find ways, and I'm not talking about, people say, well, we have an ed psych course. So the ed psych course, by and large, the way I've seen it taught, does not deal with what we're talking about right here. Could it? Sure. But most ed psych courses talk about cognitive development, human development, all issues that are important. I'm talking about a course that is very intentional around the complexities, the depth and breadth of how we see mental health issues play out across our society, how we as a society have not talked about it, the whole stigmatization of mental health issues, the way we ostracize people who have certain mental health challenges. Again, much in the way that we don't want to talk about race, and I think our failure to talk about race causes racism to continue to percolate. The same thing here with mental health. The more we avoid this, the more we are part of the problem. Again, is there pushback? Of course there is, but you spend any time in any school, the last year that I've been in schools, the number one thing I hear is that students are in need of help because something is not right with the behavior. Students are disengaged, students are not motivated, students are really struggling. And that's coupled with the teachers feeling the same way. And I think, again, that's a big wake-up call for all of us. Other thoughts or comments? And for those of you who do share the ACEs with your students, my advice, much like Susan said, I would not make it public because it's a very private matter. Yeah, I've seen that go bad. I had a colleague who did that some years ago. She had her students write their ACEs score, do the ACEs score, and then share it with other folks, and just, it was not good. There's also another one I should have mentioned that's called the Urban ACEs that looks at other issues that we don't think about in terms of poverty, racism, gender exclusion, issues around homophobia, that speaks to other factors that impact young people that we don't recognize. And I think, again, Susan is spot on. Folks, this is the power of ACEs. They don't stop just because you turn a certain age. These issues can remain with you for an entire lifetime. And in some cases, they become more challenging the older we get because we just tend to suppress them, but they're not completely eliminated. They're still manifesting in different ways. So again, this is an important topic that we have to address. So much of what I share with this stat about education school alumni not feeling prepared, it's not because they don't know how to plan lessons. It's not because they don't know how to develop units. It's not because they don't know their content. They don't know how to contend with the out of school factors that students are bringing into the classroom, because by and large, we don't talk about issues such as mental health. We don't talk about issues such as different kind of disengaged behavior. It's this factor that says that we've got to rethink teacher education in a manner that says, what is it that our teachers need if they're going to walk into today's classrooms? That's why I think what we need is a new paradigm, one that is situated around thinking about how we think about families, how we engage communities, and how schools and how communities and families inform the work we do at our universities, so that teacher preparation is holistic. It can't be this sort of flyby, sort of, we're going to just have superficial engagement with communities and families. There is also something called community trauma. There's something called intergenerational trauma. For us not to understand intergenerational trauma and community trauma, I think we are missing out on how we prepare our candidates to walk into schools that they're walking in. And let me be clear, I don't want to make this only I don't want to hope folks don't take away that this is something that only happens in poor urban and rural communities. Even in suburban communities, even in affluent communities, issues around mental health are just as prevalent. Are there other risk factors with growing up in poverty? Yes, there are. But I don't want you to think this is just a poor person's issue. Again, this cuts across all socioeconomic groups. We must begin to think about new paradigms that help us to think about teacher preparation with less of the minutia that we oftentimes have to teach our candidates, but more of the substantive issues that are sort of tied into what they're going through. I raise that because if we don't get the teacher education piece right within the current moment, we need to understand this reality. NEA just had a powerful report that came out just last month that told us that teachers are burned out. Surprise, surprise, right? Teachers are burned out and are leaving the field at levels that we have not seen in a generation. We are seeing an exodus of educators tied to the pandemic. Teachers are burned out. Teachers are stressed out. They can't deal with students in terms of their own mental health challenges. Chronic absenteeism is a big factor that's causing lots of folks to struggle with trying to keep their students on board and engaged. This is something that warrants our attention. Why? Because the data also told us that teachers of color are leaving at a higher rate than white teachers are. So it goes to our conversation yesterday. The fact that we're struggling to get teachers of color into the field, and then even the smaller numbers that we have, we see that they're leaving at rates all tied to what comes with the issues of the pandemic. And also, here's what we need to recognize, folks. This is a big equity issue. And let me tell you why it's an equity issue, because what we now know, this is an output input issue. What do I mean by that? The data we're seeing now from NEA, AACTE tells us that the number of teachers who have contemplated leaving, or more importantly, who have left in the last 2 years due to retirement, early retirement, the numbers are greater than those who are coming into the profession. Okay, folks, I'm not great at math, but I know that if more leave than what come in, that's going to leave us with some significant shortages of teachers in schools across our country. Now, why is this an equity issue? Because whenever there are teacher shortages, you all know this, I'm preaching to the choir here, the teacher shortages tend to be greatest in the areas that have the highest need, meaning our rural and urban communities are where we're going to probably see, or we're already seeing, significant staff shortages, right? I can't tell you how many principals have told me in the last 6 months, we are just searching for staff high and low. I'm trying to fill a math class. I'm looking for a science teacher. I need 5 special ed teachers. This is becoming a real factor, and we have to begin to ask ourselves the question, what do we do again to recruit, to get folks in, prepare them adequately so they stay, and even provide support for those who are currently in the profession so they don't leave prematurely. So the question becomes, why are folks leaving? You see the factors here on the top right-hand corner. It's been hard for everybody. It's been hard for us. It's been hard for our teachers who are there with students. And so we've got to, again, begin to ask ourselves, what kind of supports can we put in place? How do we ensure that our teachers are feeling seen, heard, valued, and supported? How do we keep them in this profession? Because if we don't, we face significant challenges when we talk about our most neediest populations. Thoughts or comments? I'm sure, here in our teacher education program, the last 2 years, we've seen about a 20% decrease in our number of applications, 20%. That is significant for us because it has lots of ramifications for our staffing purposes in terms of courses and faculty. And again, I don't know if this is a nationwide trend with teacher education programs, but it does raise some significant red flags for us. I'm curious to hear what others are seeing in terms of their enrollment levels.
Dr. Howard, we've seen similar numbers here at Ohio University down in Southern Ohio on the Athens campus in regards to teacher enrollment, and that's across all demographics.
Yep. So it's a challenge, and it's one that is going to require us to think differently and act differently. So, I want us to be mindful of that. The Education Week has a survey that they do around teacher satisfaction. They report having a 40-year low with regards to teacher satisfaction. a whopping 12% of teachers said that they are very satisfied with their jobs. 12%. So not only are we facing an exodus of teachers who are leaving the profession early, but even for a large number of those who are staying in the profession, they're not happy, they're not satisfied, they don't feel supported. You know, we all know that this profession is one that's about giving. If our cups are empty, we cannot give to the students that we serve. So again, I think we also need to create spaces, and we're contemplating doing a similar thing here, an alumni program where we bring back all of our alumni from our teacher education program, just to create almost like communities of support, where folks who are in the profession, who are really struggling, can talk and meet on a regular basis with other folks who can identify, who can relate, who can affirm, who can kind of offer some strategies as to how they can, you know, sort of be better in the midst of everything that's going on. We have to think about how can our universities serve as hubs or spaces that bring together our alumni, offer strategies, just give them a place of healing, if for lack of a better way of putting it, because we know we are more likely to heal when we are in community with others. We are more likely to heal when we feel like others can relate to what I'm going through. And some of that might mean that we not only do the work on our campuses, some of it might mean, look, we know there are schools that are centrally located in our communities. Sometimes it's about going to the schools where our staffs are and begin to hold those sessions there, just to ask essential questions about how folks are doing. And I've been talking to principals, and I think we need to be mindful about our principal preparation programs. Today's leaders have to do the same thing. There's got to be constant check-ins with your staff, constant affirmations of their sacrifice, their dedication and support, constant just encouragement and just appreciation for our staff, because they don't feel supported. They feel very burned out. And if we don't have leaders who are willing to acknowledge that, again, that will contribute to even sort of lower levels of staff morale. And I think that this is one of the reasons why we're seeing probably fewer folks enter to the profession, because they're hearing from folks who are in it who don't paint the most glowing picture of what it means to be a teacher. So if we help those who are in it, they feel better about the work. If they feel better about the profession, they're more likely to speak glowingly about it to those who are contemplating. So there's a connection here that we have to be mindful of. So what do we have to do? You're like my little bird there that flew away. So here we go. So part of this work also requires us to think about leadership. Leadership is a big part of this. Leadership matters. We have to think about how we transform schools, gaps. Leadership is a big part of that. The manner upon which we think about teacher preparation is also vital in how we think about leadership prep. One of the frameworks that I typically use is the work that came out of Stanford University and the work of Sean Reardon. Sean Reardon looks at these different models of leadership in schools across the country. And part of what he's found, and this is not anything new, that you look at schools that have turned around, you look at schools who are closing gaps, you look at schools that are moving the needle, the number one thing that they consistently find is that you have strong leadership teams. That's not new, but it bears repeating that leadership is important. And not just the individual leader model, but the collective leadership model. Strong leadership is vital in terms of closing gaps. Sean Reardon and his team looked at 250 what they call turnaround schools across the country. 250 schools, and they looked at what were the most essential characteristics of those schools that were either 90% students of color, 90% low income, but they showed at least a 25 to 40% increase in terms of outcomes. And the number one thing he talked about, and his team talked about, is that leadership was a core piece. And what they looked at was the most qualifying, most valuable sort of pieces of the leadership. And they said these were leaders who were equity minded. And these are the 6 sort of characteristics or features that they found of those leaders. These leaders were very intentional about raising expectations and altering norms. They were visible, engaging all stakeholders. They were clear about sort of stating their core values on a regular basis. They frequently celebrated accomplishments about what they were doing. They always elevated their wins. He really highlighted the fact that these leaders were big on relationship building. Cannot stress the importance of relationships between leaders and families, relationships between leaders and communities, relationships between leaders and central office, and they also learn how to delegate, distribute power. He really talked about the fact that the most effective leaders were not the individuals who tried to do it alone. They built powerful leadership teams around them. We have to talk to our leaders in training about the fact that what you cannot do is you cannot be the lone person who's trying to do this by yourself, because that is a recipe for burnout and disaster. It will not work. Part of what he talked about with these transformative leaders is that they had to recognize what they knew and what they didn't know, and they had to put people around them who were going to help support that vision. What is also important to note, and I share this with school board members and superintendents all the time, in Reardon's study, when he studied these leaders, what he found is that on average, and this is important to note, on average, these leaders, i.e. principals, have been in their jobs for an average of 8.5 years. 8.5 years. What does that tell us? Leaders need time to develop. Leaders need time to put their plan in place. Leaders need to be able to grow into the work. Unfortunately, what we do in public education is that we play the revolving door of principals. It is not uncommon to go to schools that are on their 4th principal in 5 years. It's not uncommon to go to schools and find principals that are in the schools that have their 7th principal in 4 years. Believe you me, the more challenging the school population, the greater the turnaround is with regard to leadership. Leadership takes time to develop. These leaders were given the time and the support to build up their capacity. Part of what he also talked about, which we don't talk about much with leadership, is that many of these leaders talked about the fact that it took them at least the first 3 or 4 years to do what is so vital for transformative leaders, which is to build a culture. Because so much of this work around transformative leadership, how do I build a culture? And building a culture means that certain people cannot be part of that culture because they are constantly resisting what you are trying to do. So the leaders talked about the fact that it took 3 or 4 years just to get the right people out and get the right people in. Because sometimes all it takes is a cluster of folks who will just eat away at the culture that you're trying to build. The negative naysayers, the constant resistors, the folks who think that this school can't ever be better, right? The folks who have been there forever who want to just kind of convince the young people that this can't ever be a better school, right? So 3 to 4 years just to get the people on board that want to move with you, just to build a culture, just to build momentum. So we have to begin to think about the ways in which transformative leadership is built on culture, is built on learning how to distribute power and delegation, how you begin to raise norms and expectations, how you have a pinpoint focus on high-level instructional development, how you begin to highlight that this is about putting kids first, not the adults first all the time. This is what we have to think about as we do more preparation of our leaders to understand the role of a leader today may look very different than it did years ago. It's not just about being an instructional leader. That's important, but there's so many other elements to being that. What we see are 2 buckets when it comes to leaders. Those who are instructional leaders, who are strong with pedagogy and engagement and the art of teaching, and then those who are strict and who are really good in managing an operation or managing an organization. What Reardon and his team says, those are important, and you can be 1 or 2 of those, or you can combine both of them, but you also have to have these elements as well that allow you to kind of do this work. The other piece that I think is important, now add this on, and I know our time is getting short, but Ibram Kendi also adds an element that I think is important for leaders, because part of what Ibram Kendi talks about is that we have to be mindful of leadership. And he says what is oftentimes lacking in the leadership framework is an intentionality around, again, the diversity pieces that we talked about yesterday. And so Ibram Kendi talks about how we have to begin to be more anti-racist in our approaches as well. And I also recommend that in more of our leadership programs that we have a focus on anti-racist approaches, given what we talked about yesterday in terms of our increasing diversity, that today's leaders are going to have to be equipped on how to lead across differences. And Ibram Kendi's work is important about looking at sort of how we think about buckets that people might be in, whether it be segregationists, assimilationists, or anti-racist, where we see assets in our students, we see assets in their families, we see assets in their communities. And so much of what our leaders need to do is be prepared to talk about those issues we discussed yesterday. But I think this also bears some real significance important for us in our departments. How can we take anti-racist stance within our departments, our schools of education, and in our respective programs. So I want to just offer a few things we can do at the university level. I think we have to begin to think about frameworks that allow us to think about across the board. How do we think about our training? I talked yesterday about the historical impact of racism. How do we engage in community needs assessment, listening to and learning from folks who are in the very communities that we are serving? We know there's oftentimes this big disconnect between universities and the very communities that they sit in. And that's why there's oftentimes this mistrust. Or there's a big disconnect between universities and colleges and the communities where we're sending the majority of our students. We have to have better community needs assessments so that we are giving and providing support that communities want and need, not what we think is best. We need to have cross-system training where we're not just engaging other educators in this work, but we're talking to other disciplines, folks in social welfare, folks in public policy, folks in medicine, because we have to think about our work in a much more multidisciplinary fashion. We need to begin to examine our own policies, procedures, and ideas, and review protocols and surveys and data around asking our students of color about how they experience our programs, because they will be our biggest ambassadors for greater diversity. If we have students of color who have not had the best experiences in our programs, it doesn't bode well for them to go back to their respective communities and offer that to us. So what does that mean? It means supporting faculty of color. Our faculty of color oftentimes feel most excluded, feel most underappreciated. Oftentimes our faculty of color have to pay what I call the diversity tax. We ask them to lead all the diversity efforts. They teach the diversity courses. They have to have the hard conversation about diversity. It means something when we have non-faculty of color who raise issues around diversity in our respective units, because there's a fatigue factor that's at play. Folk of color say we always are the ones who have to raise these issues up. When are our white colleagues going to be the ones who start acknowledging that we need to be better? Much in the way when we talk about issues around gender equity, it's usually women, mostly women, who oftentimes raise questions around gender equity, representation of women in leadership positions. It means something when men start stepping up and noticing and taking note of the fact that why don't we have more women in positions of leadership? So we have to think about how we support our faculty who are from marginalized groups. And that means doing an inventory assessment. Look at our last 10 hires. How diverse have they been? Look at our deans and our department chairs. What does that look like over the past 5 years? If we start looking at our admissions and our faculty promotion rates, some of that is really, really, really not a good sign of our commitment to diversity. The other thing we have to do, develop a strategic plan to bring in more underrepresented minority students. We cannot just sit back and wait for folks to come to us. We have to say, what's a viable plan? How do we begin to think strategically with metrics and timelines in place so we can begin to make sure that we are putting more consistent money into outreach efforts to bring more diversity into our programs? Folks, in this moment, we cannot sit back and wait to see if diversity comes to us. If we truly value it, we have to go get it. We have to go to those communities. Some of our campuses are situated right in communities of underrepresented populations, yet we don't have the outreach at churches, and we don't have the outreach at mosque. We don't talk to those community members. We don't go to those community-based organizations and begin to talk about why we want them at our respective institutions. And this is one that's a bit more non-traditional, but it's important. Oftentimes, what I've oftentimes seen at our universities and colleges, most of our diversity is not with our faculty, it's not with our students, it's with our staff. And it's oftentimes our staff who have the lowest levels of support. When you look at our custodial teams, our landscape teams, that's where the majority of our diversity comes from. And when you look at the wages that those folks are earning, it is deeply, deeply dismal, in my opinion. Now, I know we don't have the ability to sort of raise their wages, though I wish we did. I think that there needs to at least be a recognition of what these individuals do to what they mean to our campuses. I talk to many of our staff here on my campus, and they oftentimes lament the fact that there are people in our buildings who don't even acknowledge their presence, who don't speak to them. We had a group of our custodian teams that went out on strike last year. The number of faculty who didn't even show support or offer any kind of support and recognition of their quest for recognition. So again, diversity and inclusion is not just about our faculty and students. Our staff are part of our community as well. Humanizing them, recognizing their contribution is so vital in this work as well. I'm going to skip this. I talked about our new paradigm for teacher education programs. Folks, One of my favorite books on how we do this is the work by Eva Zygmunt and Patricia Clark about community-informed teacher education. It's one of my favorite reads. We did a community read with that with our teacher education program. It's about how we connect teacher preparation to communities. Bottom line, communities need to be a vital part, an integral part of how we do teacher education, even to the point where something as simple as how do we think about even offering our courses in the communities, in schools. We always ask students to come to us on our university campuses. It means something powerful to start making sure we extend to our communities in the same way. And so there's so much we can learn there. So what do we need as I get ready to close? Look, I could go on for the next several hours. This stuff is so personal and passionate for me. We need new frames of reference which explain inequality. We can't keep falling back on these deficit notions, and that goes to this notion of equity versus equality I talked about yesterday. Moving away from these narrow notions of students of color and low-income backgrounds with these very sort of narrow notions and seeing through deficit lenses. Let's use data to inform our discussion and our strategies, because the data tells us powerful, powerful, powerful commentaries. I've talked about rethinking our teacher education programs. We have to engage, but then engage and sustain courageous conversations. I talked about the need to think about our robust literacy strategies, because again, the literacy piece is so vital to overall school success for our students. I talked yesterday about how we begin to transform our school discipline approaches, because that is a big equity issue, because it pushes out young people at vital stages of development. And again, per today's conversation, we must, and I repeat, we must prioritize student mental health and educator well-being. That has to be a part of our framework, because if we don't, again, we are in many ways part of the problem. So I hope that these become big parts of what we do, and we need to all be part of this. I want to close out with a quote by one of my favorite, yet oftentimes most overlooked and unsung civil rights heroes, Bayard Rustin. He says, we need in every community a group of angelic troublemakers. Many of you are probably those folks. You are the folks who always are asking, why can't we be better? Why can't we do more? Why are we falling short here? Some folks bristle when you speak. Some folks roll their eyes when you comment. That means you're being an angelic troublemaker. An angelic troublemaker are individuals who say we have to do something different. We have to be better. We have to be able to do the things that are not comfortable, but do the things that are right. We have to do things that are not expedient. We have to do things that are right. We can't do things because they're politic. We have to do them because they're right. We need angelic troublemakers in our midst who are challenging, pushing, fighting to ensure that we don't leave a single student behind, especially in this moment of crisis, as lots of students and their families are struggling. So with that being said, I just want to say thank you for your time, for your attention, for your engagement. There's so much more I would have loved to have covered, but I want to leave some time open to see if there's any questions that folks want to get into, because you've heard a lot of me and I would love to hear from more of you.
Okay, so I'm Krista Maxson, Associate Vice Chancellor for P16 Initiatives at the Department of Higher Education. I first want to say that we are incredibly fortunate to be in a state where there are so many initiatives, so many different groups that are working towards diversifying the ed profession and addressing the ed shortage issue. There's the DO committee of the Dean's Compact that brings in wonderful speakers at a regular basis. You are one of the inspirational speakers that I feel so very fortunate to be able to have listened to, that the Dean's Compact brings in. There's the Office of Educator Effectiveness at the Department of Education that has an advisory council on diversifying the ed profession. There was a report that was completed in 2018 and published in November of 2019 about diversifying the profession and what our demographics look like in the state and how we have to do better and recommendations for making that better. That all being said, I just want to put out that there's a lot going on. There's 29 institutions sharing $5.2 million to address educator shortages that just came out in March, and they'll start implementing this fall. A lot of them focusing on diversifying the ed profession. So the ed prep deans have been meeting with state leadership, the chancellor and state superintendent, and they chose addressing educator shortages and diversifying the ed profession as the two areas of focus they wanted to work on this year. So one of the groups focusing on diversifying the ed profession broke into two groups. So this is why I bring this up to talk about we're getting ready to start implementing things, and I would like your input on any advice you'd like to give us. So in the first group, subgroup A, we really kind of focused on diversifying higher ed. So the idea is to create a state postdoc program to recruit and hire diverse faculty and establish a network of support for early career underrepresented faculty. And so that's what one group is working on. What kind of advice or things for that initiative do you think we need to consider as we move forward?
Yeah, no, thank you for that backdrop, Dr. Maxson. I think we have to walk and chew gum at the same time, right? So meaning that there are reports that have shown that when there are a higher number of faculty of color in programs, they tend to have a higher number of diverse students. It's like this idea of build it and they will come, right? And so we have to be intentional about how we look at our own faculty as a way to attract faculty from those backgrounds. So that has to be a priority. But what we found in our report, one of the more untapped populations in the educator diversity sort of work are paraprofessionals. Part of what we see in many of our schools across the country, that paraprofessionals are one of the most diverse group of people in our schools, yet rarely do they get talked to about being possibly in pursuit of becoming credentialed. Many of them have already started two-year college degrees. Many of them have two-year college degrees. Many of them are effective and amazing working with our students from diverse backgrounds, but rarely do we talk to our paraprofessionals about pursuing four-year degrees and credentials and certifications. So we have to begin to look at this population that's already in schools, that already is amazing with young people, that already understands a lot of education. Why do we then sort of completely neglect that group and go outside to look for folks who have never been in the field? So we've got to also begin to think about our paraprofessionals as a big sort of, sleeping giant that can help to increase our diversity ranks. The second piece I would recommend is, the third piece I'd recommend, as I mentioned this today, community colleges. They are again, the other sleeping giant, especially when it comes to early childhood education, because what we see there is many community colleges, two-year colleges, have early childhood education credentialing and certification, and that is where more of our underrepresented groups are. Partnerships between four-year colleges and two-year colleges don't exist to the degree that they should. Schools of education can and should play a more proactive role in connecting with those community colleges, especially the departments of education, early childhood outreach, because that can be a pipeline into our programs. And then lastly, I think we have to start looking at our grow your own programs. I mentioned that yesterday. How do we start talking to communities now? And how do we get public-private partnerships to begin to put resources? One of the biggest tasks is money. If you have loan forgiveness programs to first-generation students of color, for them to come into our profession, you'd be surprised at how many folks you can get to do this work. And then the last thing, I know I'm going far longer than I should. The last thing, and I talked about this yesterday because this continues to be a thorn in my side, probably a thorn in your side. We have to begin to rethink our credentialing requirements because so many of our students, our candidates of color, are being weeded out because of some of the requirements that are in place that are required to become credentialed or certified. So I said walk and chew gum at the same time. We got to walk, run, hop, chew gum, eat our meal. We got to do a lot of things at the same time.
Thank you, Dr. One more thing, because the other subgroup actually is working on developing regional councils. In fact, we're probably going to have some regional meetings this fall, Northwest, Northeast, Southwest, Southeast, and Central regions, where we're trying to put regional councils to address the pipeline that will include 2 years, 4 years, K-12, local business advisories, nonprofits, the access networks in the different regions. And I just want to make sure, are we missing it? Is there different people that we should consider and making sure that we make that invitation? And do you recommend trying to do that all at once, or should there be separate? I myself would like to see them on different days so I could attend all of them. What would have the biggest impact?
Yeah, I think we need to listen and learn from the models that are working. There are pockets across our own states that do a better job with this than we might be doing in our own respective districts and counties. And so we need to be finding out what are other places doing. I'm surprised and really impressed with the way in which we're looking at it locally here. A number of our, we have these small rural towns that for whatever reason have significantly higher rates of folks of color than larger urban. Like, what are they doing? And I think that they're planting those roots in those communities, talking about the power of teaching, getting the supports in place. They're just being more strategic about it, and they're being sustained in that process. But here's the other thing that they stress, and I want to sort of give them a little bit of time to this. We sometimes put the focus on the pipeline on the front end for the recruitment piece, but we don't put as much focus on the retention piece. We have to, again, we have to walk and chew gum at the same time. If we are recruiting in ways that we have fewer folks coming in than folks who are leaving out, that's defeating the purpose. We have to make sure we are talking, and we have a big project going now. We're talking to educators of color about what are their needs? What do they need to stay in the profession? And one of the things they keep saying, they need support. They don't want to be tokenized. They don't want to be seen as the discipline person. They don't want to be seen as the language person. They don't want to be seen exclusively as the discipline enforcer, right? We have to stop sort of tokenizing our folks, our teachers of color right now, because if we do, it increases the likelihood that we'll push them out. So we have to put just as much of a focus on the retention of folks as we do on the retention of folks of color.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Folks, we have a little bit of time left. Any other questions at all for Dr. Howard? Krista, I see your hand came up. Maybe no. Oh, okay. Sorry about, well, first of all, I saw Krista going like this, give us more, give us more, give us more. And I so agree. Dr. Howard, we could listen to you, I think, all day, all night. And we are going to have you come back for sure. I think if you're looking at some of the comments that we're getting, your message is hit home, and there's no question, just some great insights, great things to think about. Especially, I think the last statement for me is just being that angelic troublemaker, right? I think we need to all live that to the fullest as we go through. So thank you very much, folks. Any last questions for Dr. Howard?
Let me just say thank you all. And if I can ever be of assistance, I love the state of Ohio. I get there at least twice a year, consider it my home away from home. So got mad love for OHIO. So thank you all for what you do.
Thank you. And again, those of you who wanted some of those resources that we had talked about earlier, please send them my way. I've gotten 3 or 4 requests already. I'm more than happy to compile that list and get back to you. So again, feel free to do that. Dr. Howard, thank you so much for your time and appreciate everything you've done.
Thank you all for having me. Have a great weekend. Keep up the good work.
Folks, just to kind of recap a little bit of some things. Again, if you would take time and complete the evaluation, it's a link in the chat. That would be great. Again, it helps us really fine tune these and make them better each time we go. Also, again, if you would look at the 2022-23 meeting schedule that appears at the bottom of your agenda, that would be great. Our next meeting, September 8th and 9th, it'll be held in person in the conference center, which would be great to see folks. The address was given earlier. If you need that address again, if you're new, holler, and either Deb or myself or Tashelle will be more than happy to send that to you. Again, the remaining meetings will be held virtually, but September 8th and 9th, we're in person. And then that's about it. So I just wanted to wish everybody a great weekend. If there's anything else, Deb or Tashelle, do you want to say anything at this point, or are we good? Stanley?
I think we're good. Have a wonderful summer.
Thank you all, folks. Have a great, safe summer. Enjoy.